Frohe Albrechtsdag, Happy Jacob Albright Day. As many of you know, Jacob Albright was born on May 1st, and I've celebrated his birthday the past few years by releasing a mini-lecture on early Albright history. This year I want to tackle an important question. Did Jacob Albright own slaves? I was asked this question last year by a student in my Pennsylvania Dutch synthesis course. My student had heard several classmates call Albright a slave owner when they were passing his statue as a class. I hate to admit that I had not even considered the possibility that Albright held slaves, and I suspected that my student's classmates were under the false assumption that every 18th century American of European descent was a slave owner. The question is an important one, though, so I wanted to explore further. One reason for my initial skepticism was that Pennsylvania passed the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in 1780. However, Jacob Albright would already have been 20 years old when the act was passed, and the act did not immediately abolish slavery. Instead, it was forbidden to import slaves to Pennsylvania, and the children born to slaves would be free upon reaching the age of maturity. Current slaves in Pennsylvania, however, were to remain slaves for their lifetimes. Therefore, although the Gradual Abolition Act was the first major anti-slavery legislation in the U.S., it did not actually prohibit Jacob Albright from owning slaves. Another reason for my skepticism was that Albright was essentially a Methodist, and early Methodism criticized slavery in stringent terms. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, had witnessed with his own eyes the evils of plantation slavery when he worked as a missionary in Georgia. In his Thoughts Upon Slavery, Wesley wrote, "Where is the justice of inflicting the severest evils on those that have done us no wrong, of depriving those that never injured us in word or deed of every comfort of life, of tearing them from their native country and depriving them of liberty itself, to which an Angolan has the same natural right as an Englishman, and on which he sets as high a value. Yea, where is the justice of taking away the lives of innocent, inoffensive men, murdering thousands of them in their own land?" Despite such rhetoric, however, Southern Methodists by the early 1800s had already begun to make concessions to the economic system surrounding them, and the English denomination split into anti-slavery and accepting of slavery denominations. Certainly, therefore, there were some Methodists who owned slaves. These theological disputes had real-world impacts. In early Philadelphia, for example, in the year that gradual abolition was passed, there were only 3 Methodist slave owners. The vast majority of slave owners identified as Anglican or Presbyterian. Of course, there were also more Anglicans and Presbyterians, period, so these numbers do not compare ratios. But it is clear that slave ownership was not a Methodist thing. At the same time, clearly some Methodists owned slaves. My final cause of initial skepticism was that Albright was Pennsylvania Dutch, and the German immigrants were generally less likely to own slaves than the non-Quaker English. We can see this fact in the numbers of slave owners listed here for the Lutheran and German Reformed denominations. Nonetheless, some did hold slaves, and we can see glimpses of these German-held slaves in the advertisements for runaway slaves, such as this one. Runaway on the 30th of last month from Anthony Tate of Newton, Bucks County. a Negro man named Tony, a stout fellow, near 6 feet high, of a very yellow complexion, smooth-faced, has no beard, except a little on his upper lip, stoops a good deal, and speaks much in the Dutch dialect. In colonial America, Dutch referred to any Germanic language spoken on continental Europe, but it probably refers here to Pennsylvania Dutch. Tony spoke Dutch probably because he had grown up enslaved on a Dutch-speaking farm. One reason Germans held fewer slaves, moreover, is because they preferred the forced labor of their fellow countrymen. Colonial German papers feature many advertisements for masters seeking to track down their runaway indentured servants. These ads, such as this one for Katharina Moser, who was described as 5 foot tall, unable to speak English, and a lover of rum, are similar to the ads for runaway slaves. Although redemptioners, unlike slaves, were entitled to freedom at the end of their term, they nevertheless found the terms of their forced labor unacceptable, and frequently sought freedom in flight. All things considered, Albright, as a German Methodist, was not likely to have held enslaved persons, but it is not impossible. So, I tracked down the census records. Here we can see the entry for Jacob Albrecht in 1790, Earl Township. The first category on the left shows free white males over 16, 1. The next column, white males under 16, 1. Third column is white females. They don't receive an age breakdown. Once again, 1. Finally, slaves. None listed. In fact, in the whole township, less than 1% of the population held slaves. Jacob Albrecht also appeared in the 1780 census. I've provided the column descriptors below. Once again, no slaves. Jacob doesn't appear in another census, but his widow, Catherine, does. Here she is in the census of 1820. To the right of the description is where the slaves would be recorded. There were none in the whole district. So, did Jacob Albright own slaves? No. There is no evidence that he ever owned slaves, and his German background and Methodist leanings made him very unlikely to own slaves. Moreover, the denomination he founded, the Evangelische Gemeinschaft, was consistently anti-slavery. In 1839, for example, they added the passage shown here to their Glaubenslehre, or catechism. You'll notice in the last line that it is forbidden Sklaven zu halten oder Sklavenhandel zu treiben. It was forbidden to hold slaves or to engage in the slave trade. This image is from a volume held in our very own Gingrich Library archives. The denomination's influential newspaper, Der Christliche Botschafter, published many anti-slavery pieces, such as this article by Philanthrop, a pen name that condemns America's acceptance of slavery. As the title states, slavery is an evil. I'm not sure yet who Philanthrop was. The name means lover of humankind, and possibly puns on Philadelphia. Albright people did not confine themselves to prose. Der Christliche Botschafter published poetry on a wide variety of topics, including this piece by Johannes Dreisbach condemning slavery. It begins, Die Sklaverei im Lande, der Freiheit Spott und Hohn. Welche große Sünd und Schande für unsere Nation. I'm not going to claim that the poetic form here is a contribution to our literary heritage, but the meaning is key. Translating loosely, slavery in our country mocks and scorns the name of liberty. It is our nation's great shame and sin. Note carefully the quotation marks around Freiheit, liberty, in line 2. An early example of quotation marks used to indicate irony. Note also the date of composition, December 23rd. While others were thinking of Christmas and the holiday season, Dreisbach was contemplating the plight of slaves in America. As a side note, Johannes Dreisbach was ordained by Jacob Albright himself, and his preaching license, seen here, is the only document to preserve Jacob Albright's handwriting. You can see Albright's signature here on the bottom right. Of course, he's spelling it in the German way, Jakob Albrecht. Now, I've had to do this research during the pandemic, and I've had to rely on digital archives. I would have loved to explore Evangelical Association writings from the Civil War period, for example, but they are not yet online. Still, I wanted to close with this plaque, which we pass every day upon entry to Masters Hall. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, installed by the class of 1923 in commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the address. The class of 23 was a generation that knew about the horrors of war. They had seen their older brothers march off to the Great War. Those boys were commemorated by the class of 1921. Thousands of members of the Evangelische Gemeinschaft fought in the Civil War. Hundreds died. Union Seminary, Albright College's direct ancestor, almost closed, as most youth went to war rather than to college. I'm more or less a pacifist, and even wars in noble causes appall me. But there is no doubting our institution's commitment to the freedom of every person from the very beginning. It's an idea that grew in time. References to slavery in their publications, for example, increased as the 1840s went on. Slavery was never the dominant issue in the church. They focused on German-speaking Northerners. But from the beginning, Albright's people condemned slavery with their ink and paid for their ideals with their blood. So, Frohe Albrechtstag. Happy Jacob Albright Day. We have a lot to celebrate.